HOA demolished my lake mansion for failing to pay HOA fees. Too bad I own the entire neighborhood. James Matthews had always considered himself a man of fortune. He had worked hard for everything he had, building a successful business empire from the ground up. His achievements were impressive, but the thing he cherished most was his peaceful life at his lake mansion. Nestled at the edge of a serene lake, surrounded by trees and nature, his home was a place where he could escape the stresses of work and unwind in peace. His mansion wasn't just a building. It was his sanctuary, a reward for years of dedication and sacrifice. The neighborhood surrounding the mansion was quiet and safe, with friendly neighbors and well-maintained properties. James had always made sure to contribute to the community, keeping his home in excellent condition and helping out where he could. His neighbors respected him, and he felt like he belonged in this close-knit environment. For all the wealth he had accumulated, the simple pleasures of living in this picturesque neighborhood were more important to him than anything else. It was early one morning, as James sipped his coffee on the patio, when he noticed something strange. A letter had been slipped under his door. He didn't recognize the handwriting, but the envelope looked official, marked with the bold letters HOA at the top. HOA stood for Homeowners Association, a group that helped manage the neighborhood's standards and rules. While James hadn't had many interactions with them over the years, he was familiar with their role in maintaining order within the community. He didn't expect to hear from them, especially not with a letter that had such an official tone. Curious, James opened the letter. As he read through it, his eyebrows furrowed in confusion. The letter was a formal notice from the HOA, claiming that James had failed to pay his HOA fees for the year. According to the letter, he owed a significant amount of money, including late fees and penalties for missing the payment deadline. James blinked at the paper in disbelief. He couldn't remember ever missing a payment. He was always meticulous about managing his finances and bills, and the HOA fees had always been something he kept up with. He quickly went through his records, checking his bank statements and payment history. There it was, in black and white. He had made the payment on time. The check had been sent months ago. James was sure of it. The paperwork was clear. So why was the HOA saying he hadn't paid? Frustrated, he decided to call the HOA office. Surely there had been some mistake or mix-up that could be resolved easily with a quick phone call. He dialed the number listed on the letter, and after a few rings, a woman answered. "Good morning, HOA office. How can I help you?" the voice said cheerfully. "Hi, this is James Matthews. I received a notice from the HOA claiming I haven't paid my fees. But I have my records, and I can see that the payment went through months ago. I need to understand why I'm being charged late fees and penalties," James said, trying to keep his frustration in check. The woman on the other end seemed to check something on her end before responding. "Mr. Matthews, it appears that our system didn't register your payment. It was likely a clerical error," she explained. "However, the fees are still due and there are additional penalties for the late payment. I'm afraid the system cannot make exceptions." James felt a knot form in his stomach. A clerical error? How could something like that happen? He had always been prompt with his payments. He had done everything right. He couldn't understand why the HOA was acting so rigidly, especially when the mistake wasn't his fault. "This is ridiculous," James muttered under his breath, but he kept his tone steady. "I've always paid on time. You can see that in my records." "Can we work this out?" The woman's response was cool but firm. "I'm sorry, Mr. Matthews, but the late fees and penalties are standard. You'll need to pay the amount owed or there could be further consequences." James felt a wave of anger rising inside him. Consequences. For something that was entirely out of his control. He had always been a responsible homeowner, doing his part to maintain the neighborhood and abide by the rules. He didn't deserve to be treated like this over a mistake that wasn't his. "Is there any way to waive these fees or at least reduce the penalties?" he asked, trying to keep his composure. "I'm afraid not, Mr. Matthews. The system is clear on this matter. You can pay the balance by the end of the month to avoid further penalties," the woman replied curtly. James hung up the phone, his mind racing. He couldn't believe what was happening. He had a sudden sense of unease, like his peaceful life in the neighborhood was being disrupted by a petty mistake. It felt like the HOA wasn't interested in finding a solution or making things right. Instead, they were focused on enforcing their rules without any consideration for the bigger picture. For the next few days, James tried to get in touch with the HOA again, hoping to find a reasonable resolution. He drafted a detailed letter outlining his case, explaining that he had already made the payment and that it was the HOA's error, not his. He even offered to pay the original fee without the late charges, just to settle things quickly. But each time he tried to reach someone, he was met with vague responses or stonewalling. As the days passed, his frustration grew. It was as if the HOA wasn't interested in hearing his side at all. They simply wanted him to pay up, no matter the circumstances. The letters kept coming, demanding more money with increasingly stern language. The situation was spiraling out of control, and James began to feel like he was in a losing battle. At this point, he was ready to fight back. He couldn't let the HOA bully him into paying for something he didn't owe. But he also knew that this wasn't just about the money anymore. It was about principle. How could an organization, supposedly there to serve the community, act so callously? James had always prided himself on being a good neighbor and a responsible homeowner, and now it felt like the HOA was treating him like a criminal over an administrative error. James made up his mind. He wasn't going to back down. If the HOA wanted to take this further, they'd have to go through him first. He wasn't just going to pay the fees and let them win. He would find a way to expose their unfair practices, even if it meant taking legal action. But what James didn't know at the time was that the HOA wasn't going to stop at demanding fees. Their actions would soon escalate in a way he could never have imagined. And this was just the beginning of a battle that would shake the very foundation of his life and his peaceful neighborhood. The days after James Matthews had tried to resolve his issue with the Homeowners Association, HOA, only seemed to bring more frustration. His patience was running thin, but he wasn't going to give up. The more he thought about it, the more outraged he became. How could an error like this lead to such a mess? And why was the HOA treating him this way when it was clear that the fault lay with their system, not him? He spent the next few days working tirelessly to gather evidence. James knew that he needed a solid case to fight back. He pulled out his bank records, his checkbook, and every email exchange he had ever had with the HOA. He carefully cross-referenced the dates and amounts, putting together a clear timeline of events. He also reached out to his bank to obtain confirmation of his payment. The evidence was clear. He had paid the HOA fees, and it was the HOA's failure to process the payment that had led to the dispute. But despite having all this evidence, James couldn't shake the feeling that the HOA wasn't going to back down. Every attempt to communicate with them had been met with stiff resistance, and their refusal to even acknowledge the error left him feeling helpless. They were stubborn, and James could see that they weren't interested in a fair resolution. The tone of their letters had become harsher, more demanding. Each one seemed to contain more threats, and James started to feel the weight of the situation pressing down on him. He decided to escalate things. If the HOA wouldn't listen to reason, perhaps it was time to make them listen. James contacted his lawyer, a man named Charles Ferguson, who had represented him in the past. Charles was a seasoned professional with years of experience dealing with all kinds of legal matters, and James trusted him to handle this situation. The meeting with Charles was a wake-up call. As James explained the situation, Charles listened intently, reviewing all the evidence James had gathered. After a few moments of silence, Charles looked up from the paperwork and gave James a reassuring smile. "You've got a solid case here, James. But we need to approach this strategically," Charles said. "The HOA isn't going to back down easily. They have their own interests to protect, but we'll make sure they understand that you're not someone they can bully." James felt a bit of relief. Finally, he had someone on his side who understood the seriousness of the situation. Charles promised to send a formal letter to the HOA, demanding that they reverse the charges and correct the mistake. James had his hopes up, believing that this might finally get the HOA to act reasonably. After all, who would ignore the evidence and continue to fight a losing battle? But it wasn't long before James realized that the HOA wasn't just playing hardball. They were escalating the situation in ways he hadn't expected. One morning, as he was sipping his coffee and going over some work emails, he received an email from Charles. The message was brief but alarming. "They've taken things to the next level," the email read. The HOA has now filed a lawsuit claiming you owe them the full amount, including late fees and penalties. They've also threatened to take further action if the matter isn't settled immediately. James felt a wave of disbelief wash over him. A lawsuit? Over a simple mistake? This was getting ridiculous. His mind raced as he reread the email. He had never anticipated this kind of escalation. Why were they doing this? Wasn't there a simpler way to resolve the issue? It was clear now that the HOA wasn't just concerned with the fees. They were determined to make an example of James. It seemed that they were more interested in punishing him than in finding a fair solution. James couldn't understand their motives, but it was becoming increasingly apparent that they wouldn't stop until they had completely humiliated him. The legal process began to drag on, and James found himself caught up in a whirlwind of paperwork, phone calls, and meetings. Every time he thought things were about to calm down, the HOA would send another letter, full of threats and demands. It felt like they were trying to wear him down to force him into submission. The pressure was starting to get to him. The constant stress was affecting his work, his health, and his peace of mind. He was losing sleep, waking up in the middle of the night to check his phone for new updates. His friends and family could see that something was wrong, but James didn't want to burden them with the details. He kept everything close to the chest, determined to handle it on his own. As the weeks passed, James grew increasingly frustrated. The battle with the HOA was consuming him. He had tried everything, reason, diplomacy, legal action, but nothing seemed to work. The letters kept coming, the legal threats kept piling up, and the mansion he had worked so hard to build was being overshadowed by this petty dispute. One day, as he was walking to his car, James was stopped by his neighbor, Laura Johnson, who lived a few houses down. Laura was a kind woman in her early 40s, and she had always been friendly to James. She had heard about the issues with the HOA and had been following the situation closely. "James, I just wanted to check in and see how you're doing," Laura said, her voice filled with concern. "I know it's been tough with the HOA, but I want you to know that you're not alone in this. A lot of us are backing you up." James was taken aback. He had no idea that his neighbors were even aware of what was happening, let alone that they were supporting him. Laura explained that she, along with a few others in the neighborhood, had noticed the HOA's behavior becoming more aggressive toward homeowners in recent months. They had been raising their fees, adding fines, and generally making life harder for the residents. "We've all been talking," Laura continued, "and we don't think what they're doing is right. We're all behind you. If you need anything, whether it's legal support or just a little help around the house, we're here for you." James felt a sense of relief wash over him. For the first time in weeks, he didn't feel so alone. It was comforting to know that there were others who understood what he was going through and were willing to stand by him. It also gave him a new sense of determination. If the HOA was going to make his life miserable, he wouldn't have to face it alone. As he walked back to his mansion that evening, James began to feel something stir inside him, a growing sense of resolve. If the HOA wanted to fight dirty, he would be ready. But he wasn't going to do it alone anymore. With the support of his neighbors and his lawyer, he had a real chance to stand up to them. Little did James know that the HOA's next move would take things to an entirely new level. It wouldn't just be a legal battle anymore. It would be a battle for his home, his reputation, and his place in the neighborhood. James Matthews could never have imagined that his peaceful life would be turned upside down by a simple mistake. After months of dealing with the Homeowners Association, HOA, things had now reached a breaking point. Despite everything he had done to resolve the issue, the HOA seemed determined to make his life miserable. He had thought it would just be a matter of sorting out the paperwork, paying the fees, and moving on with his life. But instead, he found himself embroiled in a battle with an organization that had more power than he ever expected. One morning, as James was sitting in his home office trying to catch up on some work, he received an unexpected phone call. It was from his lawyer, Charles Ferguson. James could tell from the tone in Charles's voice that something was wrong. "James, I have some bad news," Charles began, his voice sounding tense. "The HOA has gone ahead and filed for a court order to demolish your mansion. They've convinced a judge that it's the only way to force you to pay the outstanding fees." James was speechless. His mind raced as he tried to process what Charles was saying. Demolish his mansion, over a simple mistake regarding unpaid fees. It seemed completely absurd. He had been diligent about his payments, and yet here they were, threatening to destroy everything he had worked for. "This is insane," James muttered, rubbing his forehead. "There must be some way to stop them, right? This can't be legal," Charles sighed. Unfortunately, James, the judge sided with the HOA. They've already obtained the order, and the demolition is scheduled for next week. The news hit James like a punch to the gut. He felt a wave of panic rise inside him, but at the same time, a deep sense of injustice began to take root. How could they be doing this to him? How could an organization whose only purpose was to manage a neighborhood have the power to destroy his home? "Charles, this can't be happening," James said, his voice shaking. "I don't even know what to do." "I understand," Charles replied calmly, "but we need to act quickly. The demolition is set to begin soon, and we have very little time to appeal. I'm already working on it, but I think we need to prepare for the worst." The words hit James like a wave of cold water. It wasn't just a small dispute anymore. This was a fight for his home. The more he thought about it, the angrier he became. The HOA had crossed a line, and James wasn't going to let them get away with it. The next few days were a blur of frantic phone calls, meetings, and preparations. James barely had time to eat or sleep as he worked alongside Charles to gather evidence, file appeals, and explore every legal avenue possible. Despite their best efforts, the situation seemed to be spiraling out of control. The demolition was just days away, and James couldn't shake the feeling that he was losing the battle. But there was one thing James hadn't considered, one thing he hadn't thought about until it was too late. In his quest to fight the HOA, he had overlooked the most important detail, the true power he held in the situation. James had always been a quiet, private person. He liked to keep his business to himself and didn't make a habit of talking about his wealth or his investments. But in all the chaos of the legal battle with the HOA, he had never stopped to consider how much he actually owned. His mansion, the land it stood on, and the surrounding neighborhood were just a small part of a much bigger picture. James had been playing the game of real estate for years, making investments and securing properties in the area without ever revealing his full hand. When he finally took a moment to review his finances, he was stunned by what he discovered. Over the years, James had secretly acquired the properties of most of the homeowners in the neighborhood. Through clever deals, negotiations, and investments, he had quietly become the largest property owner in the area, far more powerful than the HOA could ever have imagined. James had always kept a low profile, choosing not to flaunt his success or draw attention to his real estate dealings. But now, in the middle of this battle with the HOA, he realized that he held the key to ending the conflict once and for all. If he played his cards right, he could turn the tables and take back control, not just of his mansion, but of the entire neighborhood. With this new knowledge, James made a decision. He wasn't going to let the HOA get away with destroying his home. They had underestimated him, and now it was time for him to turn the situation to his advantage. He began to formulate a plan, one that would not only save his mansion, but also expose the HOA for what they were. In the following days, James met with Charles again to discuss his newfound strategy. "Charles, I think it's time to take a different approach. We're not just fighting for my mansion anymore, we're fighting for control of the entire neighborhood." Charles raised an eyebrow. "What do you mean?" James leaned forward, his eyes gleaming with determination. "I own the neighborhood, the entire neighborhood. The HOA doesn't know it, but I've been quietly buying up the properties for years. I own most of the homes here, including the land that the HOA operates on. If I play this right, I can not only stop the demolition, but I can take down the entire HOA." Charles looked at him in disbelief. "You own the whole neighborhood. Why didn't you tell me this before?" James smiled grimly. "Because I didn't need to, but now this changes everything. The HOA thought they could push me around, but they're messing with the wrong person." The next step was clear. James contacted the other homeowners in the neighborhood who were under the HOA's control, letting them know about his ownership and the steps he was taking to fight back. He was surprised by how quickly his neighbors rallied to his side. Many of them were just as fed up with the HOA as he was, and they were eager to stand with him in this fight. As the demolition date approached, James prepared to make his move. He knew that he had the power to take down the HOA and bring the entire community together under his leadership. The fight had just become personal, and James was ready to show the HOA that they had underestimated him in the worst possible way. The final showdown was coming, and James was prepared to take control of the situation in a way that no one, least of all the HOA, could have predicted. James Matthews had always prided himself on being a strategic thinker. Throughout his career, he had made calculated moves and careful investments that had allowed him to build a successful business empire. But now, standing at the precipice of an all-out battle with the Homeowners Association, HOA, James realized that the stakes had never been higher. This wasn't just about a mansion anymore. It was about reclaiming control over his life, his home, and the future of the entire neighborhood. He had spent the last few days regrouping, carefully crafting a plan that would not only stop the demolition of his mansion, but also dismantle the very institution that had tried to tear it down. He couldn't do this alone. He needed his neighbors, and he needed to outsmart the HOA at their own game. The first step was to gather support from the people who lived in the neighborhood. James was already aware of the discontent among the homeowners. Many of them had been frustrated with the HOA's aggressive tactics for years: unjustified fines, unreasonable rules, and constant pressure to pay higher fees. In a way, James had unintentionally become the voice of their frustrations. He had kept a low profile in the past, quietly acquiring properties and maintaining a sense of peace. But now, the time had come to make his power known. With the help of his lawyer, Charles Ferguson, James began reaching out to the other homeowners. He wanted to meet with them in person, face to face, and show them that he was serious about putting an end to the HOA's reign. He scheduled a community meeting at his mansion, inviting everyone to come and hear his plan. He knew that if he could convince them to stand with him, they could fight back together. The night of the meeting, James's mansion was filled with neighbors, some of whom he had never met before. There were families, retirees, and young professionals, each with their own stories about how the HOA had negatively impacted their lives. As James stood at the front of the room, he could feel the weight of the moment. This wasn't just about his mansion anymore. It was about taking a stand for everyone in the neighborhood who had been silenced by the HOA's bureaucracy. "Thank you all for coming tonight," James began, his voice steady and confident. "I know that many of you have faced your own battles with the HOA. You've probably been frustrated, just like I have, by their unreasonable demands and constant pressure. I'm here tonight because we can't let this continue. I've learned something that could change everything for us. I own this neighborhood." A murmur of surprise rippled through the room. James paused for a moment, letting the words sink in before continuing. "For years, I've been quietly acquiring properties in the area. What the HOA doesn't know is that I've accumulated most of the land in this neighborhood, properties that they think they control. But now, it's time for us to take control back. We can't let them tear down our homes or dictate how we live. Together, we have the power to take them down." As James spoke, the energy in the room shifted. People were starting to look at each other, exchanging glances of surprise and excitement. For the first time, they saw a way out of the oppressive grip the HOA had held over them for so long. James wasn't just asking them to help him save his mansion. He was offering them the chance to take back their community. One by one, neighbors began to speak up, sharing their own stories of how the HOA had affected them. Laura Johnson, the woman who had been the first to offer her support, stood up and addressed the group. "James is right," she said, her voice strong. "I've lived here for over 10 years, and I've seen how the HOA has gotten worse over time. My family and I have been fined for the smallest things, things that didn't even make sense. We've paid fees we shouldn't have had to pay. And for what? So they could pad their pockets and control us. It's time we do something about it." Another neighbor, Greg Williams, a retired engineer, stood up as well. "I'm with you, James. I've seen the financial reports the HOA has been hiding. They've been mismanaging funds and collecting more than they need. We've all been paying the price for their mistakes. I'm ready to fight back." James's heart swelled with pride as the room erupted into applause. The support was overwhelming. People were ready to stand up and demand change. They were no longer afraid of the HOA. Together, they were stronger, and together they could make a difference. With the support of his neighbors secured, James and Charles began to put the plan into motion. The next step was to publicly expose the HOA's corruption. James had spent the last few days gathering evidence of their financial mismanagement, illegal activities, and abuses of power. He had the documents, the records, and the testimonies needed to build a case that would make it impossible for the HOA to continue operating. James's team of neighbors worked together to gather even more information. They combed through old HOA records, spoke to former employees, and dug into the organization's financial dealings. The more they uncovered, the more it became clear that the HOA had been running a crooked operation for years. They had been charging exorbitant fees, imposing unfair fines, and using their position to exploit homeowners. As the evidence piled up, James knew it was time to go public. He scheduled a press conference and invited local news outlets to attend. When the day arrived, James stood in front of the cameras, flanked by several of his neighbors, each holding their own copies of the evidence they had gathered. "We've had enough," James said, his voice firm and resolute. "For years, the HOA has exploited the homeowners in this neighborhood. They've taken advantage of our trust and used their position to line their own pockets. Today, we're putting an end to that. We will no longer stand by while they tear down our homes and make our lives miserable." The cameras clicked and flashed as James and his neighbors spoke about the abuses they had uncovered. They presented the evidence, showing how the HOA had been mismanaging funds and making illegal decisions. The story spread quickly, and soon the entire community was aware of the HOA's wrongdoing. The pressure began to mount on the HOA. They couldn't ignore the public outcry, and the local government was forced to intervene. Investigations were launched into the HOA's activities, and the board members, including Sarah Caldwell, the HOA president, were put under scrutiny. James and his neighbors had succeeded in shining a light on the corruption that had been allowed to fester for so long. The HOA's actions were now under the microscope, and it became clear that their days of control were numbered. The more James learned about the inner workings of the HOA, the more determined he became. He wasn't going to let them get away with this. They had underestimated him, and now they would pay the price. As James and his neighbors prepared for the next phase of the battle, they knew that victory was within reach. But they also understood that the fight wasn't over. The HOA wouldn't go down without a fight, but James was ready. He had the law on his side, the support of his neighbors, and the power to make real change. The final showdown was coming, and James was determined to win. The pressure on the Homeowners Association, HOA, was mounting every day. The news of the corruption within their ranks was spreading, and it wasn't just the local community that was angry. The media had picked up the story, and soon, local politicians were taking notice. James Matthews could see the tides beginning to shift. What had started as a personal battle to save his mansion had now become a larger crusade to expose the HOA's years of abuse and manipulation. After the press conference, things started to move quickly. The public outcry was enormous. People from other neighborhoods that were under the control of similarly corrupt HOAs reached out to James, asking for help and guidance. Many had been going through their own struggles but hadn't known where to turn. Now, with the evidence James had uncovered, they saw an opportunity for change. The authorities were forced to investigate. The more they dug into the HOA's financial records and their dealings with contractors and local businesses, the more evidence they found. It became clear that the HOA wasn't just a small-time operation. It was a sprawling network of questionable practices. The HOA had been charging homeowners excessive fees and using their position to manipulate contractors for personal gain. It seemed that the board members, including Sarah Caldwell, the president, had been lining their own pockets with money that should have been used for community services and improvements. James watched the developments unfold from his mansion. He was no longer a passive player in this game. The battle had shifted in his favor, and now he had the power to dictate the terms. Every day, he received more calls from reporters, neighbors, and even lawyers offering their services. The momentum was on his side, but James knew that they hadn't won yet. The HOA wasn't going to give up without a fight. They were backed into a corner, and James knew they would do whatever it took to protect themselves. One morning, James was having breakfast when he received an urgent call from Charles Ferguson, his lawyer. Charles sounded serious. "James, we've just received some troubling news. The HOA has hired a new law firm, and they're taking a more aggressive approach. They filed a countersuit against you, claiming you're damaging their reputation and inciting chaos in the neighborhood. They're asking for a restraining order to prevent you from speaking publicly about their activities. James felt his blood pressure rise. The HOA was desperate now. They had nothing left to lose, but James wasn't about to back down. "Charles, we've come too far for them to just sweep this under the rug. Let's push back. Let's expose them for what they are. I'm not stopping until they're held accountable." Charles agreed. They knew this fight would be tough, but they had a clear strategy. The more the HOA fought back, the more it revealed their guilt. The truth was on James's side, and he wasn't about to let them intimidate him. In the following days, James and his legal team prepared their next move. They had gathered an incredible amount of evidence, not just from the HOA's financial documents, but also from testimonies of former employees and contractors. They were ready to take the case to court and expose the HOA's corrupt practices for everyone to see. Meanwhile, the pressure on the HOA continued to build. The public backlash was relentless. Homeowners in other neighborhoods that were governed by similar HOAs were starting to organize, demanding that the boards be held accountable. People were showing up to HOA meetings, demanding answers and threatening to take legal action. Some of the more brazen HOA boards even started to make changes, acknowledging the growing unrest among homeowners. But it wasn't enough. Not for James. As the day of the court hearing approached, James was more determined than ever to win. He knew that this wasn't just about him. It was about every homeowner who had been taken advantage of by the HOA. He was fighting for the rights of people who had been silenced for too long. He had become a symbol of resistance, a beacon of hope for anyone who had ever felt powerless against an organization that was supposed to serve them. The day of the hearing arrived, and James walked into the courtroom with a sense of quiet confidence. He had spent the last few days preparing, going over every detail of his case. As he entered the room, he saw the faces of the HOA board members, the same people who had tried to tear down his mansion, the same people who had tried to destroy his life. But now they were the ones who were under scrutiny. James's legal team was ready. They presented the evidence in a clear and compelling way, showing how the HOA had been exploiting homeowners for years. They pointed out the inflated fees, the illegal fines, and the fraudulent activities that had been covered up. The testimonies from former employees and contractors were particularly damning, painting a picture of an organization that was more interested in making money than in serving the community. The HOA's lawyer tried to defend them, but it was clear that their case was falling apart. They claimed that James's actions had damaged the HOA's reputation, but it was a weak argument. The evidence was overwhelming, and the public knew the truth. James sat there, listening as the lawyer tried to spin their story, but he couldn't help but feel a sense of satisfaction. This was his moment. He had fought for his mansion, and now he was fighting for something much bigger, a future where homeowners could take back control of their neighborhoods and stand up to corrupt organizations like the HOA. After several hours of arguments and rebuttals, the judge finally spoke. "The evidence presented today is quite clear. The HOA has acted improperly, and their actions have caused harm to many residents. I am ordering a full investigation into their financial practices, and I will issue a restraining order against the HOA's board members. Furthermore, I am ordering the immediate halt of the demolition of James Matthews's mansion." The courtroom erupted into applause. James felt a wave of relief wash over him. It was over. The victory was his. The HOA was being held accountable, and his mansion was safe. But James knew that this wasn't the end of the battle. This was just the beginning. The HOA had been dismantled, but there was still work to be done. It was time for a new system, a new way of managing the neighborhood. James didn't want to just win. He wanted to make sure that no one else would ever have to go through what he had endured. He started working with his neighbors to create a new kind of community governance, a system that was transparent, fair, and built on trust. The victory in court was just the first step. Now James was determined to reshape the entire neighborhood, ensuring that the residents, not a handful of powerful individuals, would have the final say in how things were run. The battle between James Matthews and the Homeowners Association, HOA, had been long and grueling, but now it was over. The courtroom ruling had come down in his favor, and the HOA was on the verge of collapse. As James left the courthouse that day, A wave of relief washed over him. For months, he had fought against an unjust system, and now the weight of it all seemed to lift from his shoulders. But as the dust settled, James knew that his victory wasn't just about saving his mansion. It was about something much bigger. It was about creating lasting change, about ensuring that no one would ever have to face the kind of mistreatment he had endured at the hands of the HOA. The weeks following the court ruling were a whirlwind. The news spread quickly. James had exposed the corruption of the HOA, and now the world was paying attention. He became a symbol of resistance, a beacon of hope for homeowners everywhere who had been at the mercy of oppressive HOAs. The media coverage was non-stop, with local news stations, newspapers, and even national outlets covering the story of the man who had taken down a corrupt organization that had been terrorizing neighborhoods for years. But James wasn't interested in the fame. He wasn't looking for accolades or praise. What mattered to him was ensuring that his neighborhood, and others like it, would never again fall victim to the kind of tyranny he had experienced. The fight had been exhausting, but now it was time to build something new. The first thing James did was meet with his neighbors. The support they had shown him during the fight was unwavering, and now it was time to give back. He invited everyone to a community meeting at his mansion, where he would lay out his vision for the future of the neighborhood. As the neighbors gathered in his grand living room, James looked around at their familiar faces. These were the people who had stood by him when things seemed bleak, the people who had been ready to fight alongside him when the HOA had tried to tear his life apart. They were the reason he was standing here today, victorious. "Thank you all for being here," James began, his voice steady and full of purpose. "This fight was never just about me, it was about all of us. And now that we've won, we have an opportunity to create something better. A neighborhood that's run by the people, not a group of self-serving individuals who only care about their own power." The room was filled with nods of agreement. Everyone could feel it, the sense that this was a turning point, that things were finally going to change for the better. "I've been working on a plan," James continued. "It's time for us to take control. No more HOAs, no more outside forces dictating how we live. We need to form a new kind of community, one where we make the decisions together, one where transparency, fairness, and respect are the foundation of how we operate." There was a buzz of excitement in the room. The neighbors had seen how the HOA had manipulated and controlled their lives for years, and now they were being offered a chance to have a real say in how their community was governed. The idea of taking back control was liberating, and James could see that they were eager to get started. He outlined the plan for a new community governance model, one where every resident would have a voice and a vote in decisions that affected them. It wouldn't be run by a small group of board members with their own agendas. Instead, the decisions would be made democratically, with input from everyone. There would be no hidden fees or fines, and the community would be run transparently, with clear communication and accountability. "We'll form committees for different aspects of the neighborhood," James explained. "Things like maintenance, security, and community events will be overseen by residents who care about those issues. We'll work together to make sure that every decision benefits the people who live here, not just a handful of people at the top." The neighbors were thrilled with the idea. They had all been frustrated with the old system, where decisions were made behind closed doors with no regard for the people who lived in the community. Now they had a chance to build something better, something that reflected their values and priorities. James knew that the process would take time. There would be a lot of work ahead, setting up the new system, organizing the committees, and getting everyone involved. But he was confident that the community was ready for this change. They had been through a lot together, and now they had the opportunity to reshape their future. As the weeks passed, James worked closely with his neighbors to implement the new governance model. It wasn't easy, but everyone was committed to making it work. They held regular meetings to discuss important issues, and soon, committees were formed to tackle various tasks around the neighborhood. Whether it was organizing neighborhood cleanup days, planning social events, or addressing safety concerns, the community was now involved in every aspect of their neighborhood's operation. But James didn't stop there. He wanted to make sure that the lessons learned from this fight would carry forward, not just in his neighborhood, but in others as well. He reached out to communities across the country that had been dealing with similar issues, offering them advice and support. He worked with legal experts and advocacy groups to create resources that homeowners could use to fight back against corrupt HOAs. James also began speaking at public forums and events, sharing his story and educating others about their rights as homeowners. He became a passionate advocate for community empowerment and the elimination of unfair HOA practices. His message resonated with people everywhere, and soon, he was receiving invitations to speak at conferences and to meet with lawmakers who were interested in reforming HOA laws. As the months went by, James saw real change take shape. His neighborhood was thriving, and the new governance system was working. The community was more connected than ever, and people were proud of the progress they had made. They had built something lasting, something that would ensure their voices were always heard. The impact of James's victory rippled far beyond his own neighborhood. Across the country, homeowners were starting to stand up to their HOAs, demanding transparency, fairness, and respect. James had sparked a movement, and the once feared HOAs were beginning to lose their grip on communities everywhere. As he stood on the balcony of his mansion one evening, looking out over the peaceful neighborhood that had once been filled with tension and uncertainty, James felt a sense of pride. He had not only saved his mansion, but he had also helped create a better future for everyone in the community. The fight was over, and James had emerged victorious. But the real victory wasn't just in the courtroom or in the destruction of the HOA. The real victory was in the change they had created, a change that would echo for generations to come. James smiled to himself, knowing that this was just the beginning. The power was back where it belonged, in the hands of the people.